Welcome to Lesson 4. In this lesson, we will discuss how we would emulate the token impersonation. The goal of this lesson is to take the information from the previous lesson and use it to plan out. Suppose we want to emulate FIN8's bad hatch malware campaign. In particular, as we saw earlier, the available CTI article showed us the overall context surrounding the token impersonation. If we want to emulate the access token manipulation behavior in this campaign, we can start by emulating. In our case, we don't have access to the real PowerShell script that was used in the bad hatch campaign. Breaking down our implementation plan further, we have the following recipe. First, then, we'll see if we can leverage any existing open source resources to avoid reinventing the wheel. Once our PowerShell script is ready, we'll want to test it to verify correct execution. You can even take things a step further in the emulation by incorporating elements from the bad hatch campaign since PowerShell doesn't provide native commandlets out of the box that allow us to perform token impersonation. Let's look at how we would accomplish this step by step. First, we can then pass that process handle to open process token to obtain a handle to the LSAS. We then call duplicate token EX to duplicate the LSAS token. Note that we would call Lastly, we pass our duplicated primary token to the create process with token. As mentioned before, we can turn to open source PowerShell frameworks to see if there's anything already out there. Looking at the example use cases provided in the script, we see that the script provides a custom command. However, we still want to dig into the underlying PowerShell script to confirm that the correct API calls are. If we take a closer look, we'll see that the create process example in the script. We have now reached the end of Lesson 4. In this lesson, we took the information from Lesson 3. For more information, please see the following references.